All right, next we're going to look at the growing U.S. government deficits that we've seen over the last 2 decades or so and the implications for economic performance, aka economic growth. All right, so one question that came about right after the Great Recession was, is there a relationship between U.S. budget deficit, I believe that should say budget deficit, not trade, budget deficit. Oh no, wait, I'm sorry, this is correct. Is there a relationship between the U.S. trade deficit and the federal government budget deficit? So recall that the trade deficit is basically net exports, right? The difference between imports and exports, or sorry, exports minus imports. Yeah, same thing. So is there any relationship between our net exports and our government budget deficit? So a trade deficit occurs when the value of imports exceeds the value of exports. Otherwise, if it's the other way around, it's called a trade surplus. But for the most part, we import a lot more in terms of dollar value than we export. So we have, in most years, as far as I know, a trade deficit. And some economists say it appears that there's a relationship between trade and budget deficits, and that at the very least there's a statistical correlation, right? It may not be causal, but there's at the very least a correlation. So here we see them plotted on a graph, and we can pretty clearly see the correlation, right? They seem to move in the same directions. Let's see here. This is the budget surplus or deficit. So the red line is the budget surplus or deficit. The green line is the trade surplus or deficit. So we can see that they definitely are correlated. Now, whether or not one causes the other is a different question. But basically, as the government borrows funds to finance the deficit, the budget deficit, and domestic private consumption does not decrease, some of these funds will be borrowed from foreigners. And the interest rate paid on the bonds will need to be high enough to attract these foreign investors. Now, if foreigners are using the dollars that they hold to buy government bonds, then they have fewer dollars to spend on our exports. And so this is kind of where the relationship is coming in. This shows that the U.S. budget deficit can contribute to a trade deficit, right? So again, if foreigners are lending us their money, they have less of that money to spend on our goods, on our exports. So that's where the deficit, the budget deficit and trade deficits, that's how they're related. Now, how do higher deficits affect the economy in the short run? Now, if the economy is in a recessionary gap, right, below full employment, the deficit can help to close the recessionary gap. This is what we saw in the last chapter with expansionary fiscal policy, right? The government spending money or reducing taxes to get us out of a recession. But if the economy is already at full employment, long-run equilibrium, the deficit can create an inflationary gap and kind of overheat the economy and push prices higher. So those are the effects in the short run. What are the long-run macroeconomic effects of higher budget deficits? Well, in the long run, higher government budget deficits should theoretically have no effect on equilibrium real GDP, right? Because that's the horizontal long-run aggregate supply curve. So ultimately, government spending in excess of government receipts simply redistributes a larger share of real GDP per year to government-provided goods and services. That's all it's really doing. So there's really no macroeconomic effect in the long run. And thus, if the government operates with higher deficits over an extended period, basically the ultimate result is a shrinkage in the share of privately produced goods and services. So again, think crowding out, right? And by continually spending more than it collects, the government takes up a larger and larger portion of economic activity, all while we're accumulating debt.